Hey guys. Okay, so this will be the first video for our unit or period 2, the organization and reorganization of human societies. Now this picks up around the year 600 BCE, so we're past the really ancient civilizations, and now we're getting into more of our classical civilizations. We'll talk about some of the major empires, starting with Persia, going through the Roman Empire, Han Dynasty in China. We'll talk about the foundations of Greco-Roman civilization and so forth, and then get us up kind of with the fall of some of those major civilizations, namely Rome and Han China, around the year 600 CE or so. Okay, so the first thing we're going to get into is, as I said, the first of those major empires, which is the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire, it wasn't the first empire that the world had ever seen. You had the Akkadians, you had the Babylonians, and so forth, but this was the first kind of major empire. When we think of an empire, we think of a large area of land, and we also think of an area, ruling over a kind of a wide variety of people. And that certainly is what the Persian Empire is. You look at down in here, kind of the Persian homeland. I'll show you a better map for that in a second. And it expanded all the way, through the Middle East, to India, all the way up to Greece, including Egypt and so forth. So it was a big empire. I'll go over some more of these specific regions later. But when we talk about imperial rule, the Persians in many ways set the standard for it, in terms of strong rule, but also tolerance and allowing people to do their own thing. Okay, so what we consider to be the beginning of this Persian Empire really starts around 558 BCE. That's with the beginning of the Achaemenid dynasty. We'll talk more about them in a sec. You don't have to write that down. If you're also wondering, how do I spell that? I'll put that up in a second. And it goes up until about 661 CE. So it's a long period, that the Persian Empire. Now, it wasn't all just one dynasty. You had a couple of different ruling eras, but it would last up until the conquest by the Islamic empires. As Islam very quickly spread through and the Arab empire spread into Persia, they would eventually dethrone the last of the Persian monarchs. But the influence of the Persian Empire, kind of with their administration and customs, that would carry forward and would have a great influence on throughout the Islamic world and on the Arab world as well. But we'll talk more about that in a later chapter. They were an Indo-European people. Remember, Indo-European is a language family. Okay, so we're looking at this area in here, Iranian, Farsi is a language. And so there is some relation to the Iranian language and Indian languages, as well as Western European languages and so forth. So that's an important thing to remember. And as they came down through Central Asia, a lot of these people that we talk about through, the northern Middle East, and they come through, they started out as Central Asian pastoralists, meaning that they were herders. They were very adept on horseback. You think of some similarities to the Huns we're going to talk about later in the Roman Empire, and then obviously the apex of all of this would be the Mongols, as they ran rampant throughout most of the known world at this time. But they would migrate their way down into the Iranian plateau, and they kind of separate into three different regions. You have Parthia, you have Media, and you have Persia. And you think, well, isn't everything Persia? Not specifically, okay? Persia is, the kingdom took its name after the homeland of the first rulers, the Achaemenid rulers. So it kind of became an encompassing term for it, but if we're being very technical, the Persians were a separate people from the Parthians and the Medians. And lastly, they were polytheistic. We think of Iran as being a stronghold of Islam today, and it absolutely is, and we'll talk later about it being the birthplace of Zoroastrianism. But the original Persians, when they came down, from the steppes of Central Asia into the Iranian plateau, they were polytheistic. All right. So, as I said, the Persian Empire really starts with this dynasty called the Achaemenid dynasty. And the Achaemenid dynasty begins with this guy, Cyrus. Now, Cyrus was Persian. If we're being very technical, he was from that specific area of Persia that I just showed you on the map. And he went out and he conquered a number of the surrounding areas. He was a military genius. Aside from his ability to command armies, he was also known for being very tolerant. he allowed the people that he conquered to retain an awful lot of their cultural identities, their religious beliefs, their political institutions, as long as they acknowledged him as being the supreme leader. You see him as he took on an almost godlike stature. You see here with the wings and so forth. And he was, in many areas, he was well liked and respected. In some areas, almost revered. He was beloved by the Jews because he allowed them to return to Jerusalem after they were driven out by the Babylonians. He incorporated local religious beliefs like he did in Mesopotamia. He made a connection between himself and Marduk, their god. So he really knew how to play the game well and how to get the people that he conquered to not only accept him, but in some cases love him as opposed to resent and hate him. So he was the first one. And you see the areas. So Persia, this area here is where it started from. And then as he conquered outward through Media, up into the Indus River Valley, through the rest of the Middle East, the Neo-Babylonia. The Babylonian Empire was conquered in 539. Lydia, which today would be Turkey. All right, he conquered that in 547. Egypt, not yet. We'll talk about that in a second. But the majority of the Fertile Crescent, right, this area through here, that was conquered by Cyrus during his lifetime. Not Greece, but again, we'll talk about them later. And then Cambyses, his son, completed the conquest of the Nile Delta in here in Egypt. Okay. Other than that, not a tremendous amount of distinction with Cambyses. He didn't rule for all that long. He was succeeded by a much more notable ruler, and that was Darius. Darius was actually not a blood related to Cyrus and Cambyses. But after Cambyses died, there was a dispute over the throne and battle for it. And Darius, who was a member of the military, he was a high-ranking member of Cambyses' court, he was able to maneuver enough people, in loyalty and so forth, and was able to claim the throne for himself. And he was known as the Great. Okay, he was largely considered to be the greatest of the Achaemenid and some would say overall Persian rulers. He expanded the size of the empire. Let me get rid of these so they're not in the way here. Okay. And you see this was a big one. Aside from Egypt and the areas, he even had a little bit up, kind of into the Balkan Peninsula of Thrace and down all along the Indus Valley, into India, Bactria, which today would be Afghanistan and Pakistan and so forth. His empire was so vast that at the height of its rule, he ruled over 50 million people. And given overall population levels of the earth at that time, historians kind of figured it out that mathematically he probably ruled over about 44% of the world's population. So it was impressive what he was in charge of. Very, very powerful ruler. Okay, I'm going to go over one other thing here in this video. So with Persian rule, the Persians were very effective